The sun hung high over the Arizona desert, the horizon stretching out in shimmering waves of heat, the asphalt a long ribbon cutting through endless dry land. Malcolm Grant drove with his window half rolled down, the hum of wind mixing with the soft crackle of Bill Withers' voice on the radio. The world outside looked still, but Malcolm knew better than to be lulled by calm. He had lived long enough to recognize how quickly peace could turn brittle. The black Dodge Charger carried him forward, its steady rhythm a small reminder that for once he wasn't answering encrypted messages or huddled in briefing rooms. For once, he wasn't the deputy director of the DEA. He was just Malcolm, a middle-aged uncle finally making his way back to family he had not seen in years. His sister's house in Tucson was still hours away, but the thought of hugging her again, of tossing a ball with his nephew in the backyard, filled his chest with something close to warmth. He had missed birthdays, graduations, countless dinners, each absence another reminder of the cost of a life lived in service. For decades he had fought cartels, tracked drug corridors, stared down men who would kill him without hesitation. Now, on this quiet road, he tried to savor the rare taste of normal. Yet even in that moment, he could not fully switch off the instincts sharpened by 20 years in the field. They lived under his skin like muscle memory, always whispering, always watching. A shift in the silence was all it took. One glance in the rearview mirror and his ease began to harden. At first, the headlights behind him were distant, a harmless speck on the empty road. But within minutes, they grew larger, brighter, far too close. The patrol car followed without siren, without urgency, hugging his bumper like a predator circling prey. Malcolm tapped the cruise control, 63 in a 65 zone. Perfectly legal. No weaving, no speeding, nothing to warrant this attention. He knew the game before the lights even flashed. His spine stiffened, though his hands stayed loose on the wheel. He had been here before. Not on this exact stretch of highway, but in this very moment countless black men knew by heart. A nice car, a solitary driver with dark skin, and officers looking for a reason. He breathed slow, steady, as red and blue lights ignited his rear view. Gravel crunched when he guided the Charger onto the shoulder, parked in the shimmering heat, and rested his palms on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The open road stretched in front of him, freedom so near, but trouble walked behind in polished black boots. The driver's door of the patrol car opened, and out stepped a tall white officer with squared shoulders and an ease in his stance that reeked of unchecked authority. Sergeant Ray Dullard, his badge would later confirm. He did not move quickly. He did not have to. This was not an emergency stop. This was a performance, a display of power. A second door opened and another figure appeared. Officer Nate Coyle, younger, leaner, with restless energy twitching through his limbs. He adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, smirking faintly as he circled to the passenger side of Malcolm's car. It was a textbook maneuver, one officer distracting while the other prowled. Malcolm rolled his window halfway. Enough for conversation, not enough for hands to intrude. "Afternoon, sir," he said, voice smooth, respectful even. His calm was not submission. "It was control. License and registration," Dullard demanded, squinting into the car as though expecting to find something more than the faint smell of desert dust. "No problem." Malcolm reached deliberately, 2 fingers at a time, movement slow enough for even the jumpiest trigger finger to interpret. He retrieved his documents from the glove box and handed them over. As he did, he caught sight of Coyle in the side mirror, not studying the license plate or the vehicle identification, but eyeing the trunk with thinly veiled intent. The air thickened. Malcolm knew that shift. He had seen it before. Dullard held the license longer than necessary, his lips curling into a smirk as he mispronounced the name. "Dean Grant?" he read aloud. "Malcolm," Grant corrected quietly. The sergeant gave a small nod to his partner, barely perceptible, but Malcolm caught it. He knew then this was not a traffic stop. It was a setup. He had seen officers like this too many times. If they could not find a reason, they would create one. The readiness inside him clicked into place. Not fear, not rage, simply the calm before action. "You know why I pulled you over?" Dullard asked, leaning closer to the window. One hand resting near his holster, the other gripping Malcolm's license as if possession equaled dominance. No. Sir, Malcolm replied, measured and calm. You were drifting lanes. Maybe tired, maybe distracted. I was within the lines. Cruise control held steady at 63. The smirk widened, amused at the audacity of this man to respond with facts. Step out of the vehicle for me. The words weren't a request. They were a test of obedience. Malcolm hesitated only a second, not because he doubted his choice, but because he understood what stepping out meant. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. Still, he opened the door slowly, keeping his hands visible as he stood. His posture was open, his movements unhurried. Across from him, Officer Coyle circled like a vulture, mirrored lenses hiding his eyes, but not the delight in his smirk. You traveling alone? Coyle asked, already knowing the answer. I am, Malcolm replied evenly. Heading where? Tucson? Dullard interrupted loudly, voice cutting the air like a blade. His tone carried no curiosity, only accusation. Then came the demand. Pop the trunk. Is there a specific reason, Sergeant? Malcolm asked. His voice remained calm, but the words were a line drawn in sand. Dullard's face tightened, the mask of false civility slipping. He stepped closer, too close, his presence invasive. Are you refusing a lawful order? No, sir. I'm asking on what legal grounds you're requesting access to my property. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with implication. Coyle snorted, feigning amusement. Probably nothing back there, right? Just groceries and goodwill. Dullard tilted his head, smirk never fading. Suspicion of narcotics based on vehicle behavior and refusal to comply. It was a script, flimsy but often effective. Malcolm looked past them toward the horizon painted gold by late afternoon sun. He sighed, a long, steady exhale, then pressed the trunk release. The sound of the latch echoed louder than it should have, a mechanical click that felt like the opening of a vault. Coyle moved quickly, swagger in his steps. He didn't search with caution. He rummaged with certainty. Within minutes, he emerged holding a clear plastic bag filled with off-white powder, holding it aloft like a trophy. Well, well, Coyle announced, his voice loud enough to carry down the empty highway. Not so clean after all, huh? Dullard shook his head slowly, feigning disappointment, playing to an audience of none but themselves. That's a shame, Mr. Grant. Malcolm did not flinch. His expression did not crack. He had seen lies planted before, but this one stung with personal venom. His voice came flat, steady. That's not mine. You expect us to believe that? Dullard asked, tone dripping with contempt. Felony weight in your trunk and you didn't know? I'm saying you didn't find it. You planted it, Coyle's smile twitched. That's a bold accusation. No, Malcolm replied, his gaze unwavering. That's a fact. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with intimidation. It was charged with something else, something the officers hadn't expected. A man who wasn't afraid of them. Hands behind your back, Dullard snapped, drawing the line. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute. Malcolm turned without resistance, offered his wrists. The cuffs clicked shut, metal cold against his skin. He knew the feel of them well. He had placed them on countless others. This time, they weren't a symbol of guilt. They were a countdown. The officers didn't bother with Miranda rights. They didn't bother with explanations. They wanted humiliation, not procedure. Dullard yanked open the door of the cruiser and shoved Malcolm down across the hood. The metal burned against his forearms in the desert heat. His sunglasses fell, clattering to the asphalt, his hat rolling away in the dust. Still, he did not fight. His calm was more cutting than resistance. Still think you're better than us? Coyle whispered near his ear, smug and venomous. You people always do. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, and in a voice steady enough to slice through the heat, replied, I know who I am, and soon you'll wish you hadn't asked. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. Only for a second, but it was there. Yet arrogance is a stubborn fuel. Dullard shoved him upright, patting him down with unnecessary force. Pain delivered in place of respect. From across the road, an SUV slowed, a family staring silently. Their eyes met Malcolm's for only a moment before the car rolled on. He was not a man to them in that instant, only a spectacle. They stuffed him in the back of the cruiser, slammed the doors shut, and drove 25 long minutes through desert heat. Sweat soaked into his shirt, but he sat upright, silent. They mocked him, tried to provoke him, but he gave them nothing. His silence was not weakness. It was warning, Dullard muttered as he drove. 22 years I've been doing this. You can always tell the ones who think they're untouchable, Coyle chuckled. Some cry, some beg. Not this one. Makes it fun. Malcolm stared ahead, eyes steady, mind already calculating. They thought this was the beginning of his downfall. In truth, it was theirs. When the cruiser finally pulled into the station, the doors opened with a metallic clunk. Malcolm stepped out calmly, still cuffed, still silent. He walked through the lobby under the weight of stares, past rookies and veterans alike. Most averted their eyes. One young black officer at the desk looked up, recognition flickering across his face, but he said nothing, just gave the faintest nod. Malcolm returned it. Sometimes dignity is shared in silence. The officers bypassed procedure, ignored intake protocols, barked orders to rookies. Interview room B, Dullard snapped. Before stepping inside, Malcolm spoke evenly. You better get this paperwork right. Dullard scoffed. You'll be lucky if anyone even takes your call. Then the door closed behind them, sealing him in. What they did not know, what they could not imagine, was that they had just cuffed the deputy director of the DEA, a man whose name carried weight in every federal circle. And the trap they believed they had set was about to collapse on them instead. The air inside the small interview room was heavy, thick with that recycled staleness unique to precinct walls that had absorbed too many lies and too many confessions. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their pale glow painting the room in the kind of sterile gloom meant to break people down. Malcolm sat in the metal chair, wrists still cuffed, posture straight. He didn't lean forward, didn't slump back. He occupied the space without conceding to it. To anyone looking, he seemed like just another man picked up off the road. But his silence carried weight, and silence was the sharpest weapon he had at the moment. Outside the door, Sergeant Ray Dullard and Officer Nate Coyle congratulated themselves in low mutters. To them, this was a clean bust. No witnesses who mattered, no cameras in the right places, no oversight in a backwater county that looked the other way. They had planted evidence before, made charges stick against men who had no one to defend them. To them, Malcolm was another easy statistic. Another black man whose denial wouldn't matter once the bag of powder hit the evidence room. But inside, Malcolm was counting minutes, rehearsing facts, and waiting for the machine he had spent his life serving to recognize what had just happened. Because the DEA was never far. Even in the desert, the system pulsed with invisible wires, and Malcolm knew those wires would soon hum with his name. At the intake desk, a rookie shuffled nervously. Daniel Rios had only been out of the academy 6 months, his uniform still crisp, his hope for the job not yet dulled by cynicism. He was supposed to process the new arrest, log the charges, feed the system the data it craved. When the sergeant barked his orders, Rios moved quickly, pulling up the form on his terminal, typing in Malcolm T. Grant. The screen blinked. Access denied. Rios frowned. Tried again, full name. Middle initial. Even the driver's license number copied directly from the documents. Again, access restricted. His brow furrowed. Street arrests never triggered this kind of firewall. Confused, he double-checked the system, tried to run the ID against state records. Blocked again. It was as though the man sitting quietly in interview room B didn't exist in any local system. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A thought crept in. What if this wasn't a normal arrest? What if he was staring at something bigger than the men who had dragged Grant in? To be thorough, he reached for a secondary channel, one designed to check external federal databases. It was rarely used, the kind of tool rookies only read about in training. He entered the name again. The screen flickered, and this time a red box appeared. Access restricted. Clearance required. Contact DEA Field Ops. Code, Phoenix Lock. Rios felt his throat go dry. He read it again, convinced he had mistyped, but the message stayed. Only a handful of entries triggered that protocol, and all of them involved people who outranked anyone in this station. He swallowed, then glanced toward the hallway. He could still hear Dullard's voice, smug and careless, and Coyle's easy laugh. He turned back to the screen and made a choice. His hand reached for the landline marked Emergency Federal Confirmation, the line that was never supposed to be used casually. He dialed, gave the code, and waited. The phone clicked, and a woman's voice answered, crisp and sharp. Name and badge number. He gave both. A pause. Then the tone of her voice shifted. Fingerprint or iris scan required. Do you have him in custody? Yes, ma'am, Rios stammered. Interview room B. Scan him now. His hands shook as he grabbed the portable biometric scanner, walked to the interview room, and stepped inside. Malcolm looked up at him, calm, unreadable. For a second, Rios almost forgot what he was doing. He lifted the scanner, pressed it against Malcolm's thumb. The device chirped, data transmitting. 3 seconds later, the phone line in the hall rang again. Rios hurried back, answered, and the voice returned. No longer just sharp, but urgent. You're holding Deputy Director Malcolm Grant of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He is on a protected clearance list. He is not to be detained, searched, or questioned. Where are the arresting officers? Rios froze, eyes darting toward the corridor. They left. Through the south exit, maybe 10 minutes ago. Cameras. The hallway feed isn't working. The silence on the other end was long and heavy. Then the woman snapped, Shut the building down. Lock every exit. Do not let him walk out without federal coordination. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. The line went dead. Rios stood there for a moment, heart pounding, before turning back toward the interview room. He opened the door slowly. Malcolm sat exactly as before, but his eyes told Rios that he had heard everything. Stand up, Malcolm said quietly. Walk with me, Rios obeyed. Malcolm's wrists were still cuffed, but his presence filled the room like the cuffs didn't matter. As they stepped into the hallway, Malcolm reached inside his jacket lining with careful precision and drew out a worn black leather wallet. He unfolded it slowly, and inside gleamed a federal badge heavy with authority. DEA Deputy Director. Lock down your station, officer, Malcolm instructed. His voice was low, steady, commanding. Right now. This is a federal crime scene, Rios didn't question. He stumbled back to the desk, hit the emergency override, and every door in the precinct clanked shut. Steel barriers slid into place. Red lights flashed, alarms blared. Confusion erupted in the bullpen. Officers shouted, What the hell is going on? Chairs scraped. Radios crackled. Within seconds, the station was sealed tight. A broad man stormed into the chaos. Lieutenant Warren Hobbs built like a brick wall, his jaw set in permanent defiance. He spotted Malcolm in the hallway, eyes narrowing. Who the hell are you to issue a lockdown in my station? He barked. Malcolm stepped forward, badge in hand. Deputy Director Grant, DEA. Your officers just planted narcotics on a federal agent and attempted an illegal arrest. They fled this building, disabling your cameras on the way out. Hobbs scoffed, lips twisting into something between disbelief and defiance. You expect me to believe that? Malcolm didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small USB drive. This contains backup cloud footage from my body cam. Audio logs, GPS timestamps. You have 2 choices, Lieutenant. Interfere, and I report obstruction of a federal investigation. Or help me find them, and you keep your badge. The room stilled. For a moment, Hobbs looked ready to erupt, but then something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, fear, survival. He stepped back, muttering, Officer Rios, do what he says. Rios nodded quickly, his face pale but determined. He turned to Malcolm. Sir, what can I do? Malcolm's voice softened, if only slightly. You already did it. The weight of the words sank into the rookie like a vow. He had chosen a side, and it wasn't with the men who had framed Grant. Within minutes, the building pulsed with the sound of federal sirens. Outside, backup units arrived, not to aid the local station, but to secure it for investigation. Inside, whispers rippled among the officers. Some averted their eyes, some exchanged nervous glances. The presence of Malcolm Grant, the calm authority he exuded even in cuffs, unsettled the entire room. He wasn't here for drama. He was here for facts. He dialed a number on his phone. Lane, he said simply. I need you now. Marcus Lane had been his partner for years. a forensic analyst who had traded fieldwork for labs but never lost the instincts of a soldier. When Malcolm called, Marcus moved. 27 minutes later, he strode into the evidence room, lab coat half-buttoned, laptop under his arm. His eyes scanned the sealed bag sitting on the table, the very one Coyle had waved around on the roadside. "Let me guess," Lane said dryly. "They pulled this out of your trunk after a busted taillight stop?" "No taillight." "No cause," Malcolm replied evenly. Lane pulled on gloves, slid the bag into a portable scanner, and typed in his access code. The machine whirred, lights blinking before spitting out a chemical signature. Lane's whistle cut through the room. "Bingo, this batch came from Ngales, Liberia. Seized during Operation Silverthorn in 2022, DEA custody only. Never made it into public records." Malcolm nodded slowly. "So how did it end up in my car?" Lane's expression darkened. "Either someone inside the DEA is leaking sealed evidence or someone hacked our internal database." From the corner, Rios cleared his throat. He had been listening, quiet, absorbing. "Sir, I think I've seen something. Every time we file reports, they route through the main archive. But about a month ago, I noticed some reports being rerouted first, bouncing through an unregistered node." He tapped at a terminal, lines of code flashing across the screen. "One name keeps showing up attached to those reroutes. Elvos." The name hung in the air like a shadow. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Not fully, not yet, but enough for his instincts to sharpen. Before he could explain, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. A woman appeared in the doorway, jeans, leather boots, press pass swinging from her neck. Leah Torres, investigative reporter, known for exposing corruption and never asking permission. She carried a tablet under her arm, eyes sharp. "You're Grant?" she asked. "I am," Malcolm said, steady. "I heard you locked down a precinct." "You're not wasting time." "Neither are you." Leah handed him the tablet. On the screen was a spreadsheet, rows of names, dates, officer IDs. 47 cases, she said. All minorities. All arrested by 2 or more officers from this precinct. All with drugs that magically appeared. And in every case, body cam footage was either missing or corrupted. Malcolm scrolled slowly, eyes catching names he recognized and many he didn't. Leah pointed. "This one, 16 years old. Lost his scholarship. This one, mother of 3. Fired from her job. And this one?" She tapped another row. "Died in custody. Heart failure, they said. His mom's still waiting for answers." Lane leaned over, studying the list. "And every single case had either Nate Coyle or Ray Dullard involved." Leah nodded grimly. Rios stepped forward again, tapping at the code. "That Elvos tag, it doesn't match any badge IDs, but it shows up in the admin files as a backdoor override. Whoever it is can shut down cameras, reroute audio, erase logs." Malcolm's voice was low, steady. "You're saying someone built their own backdoor into the police system?" Rios nodded, eyes wide. "That's not just corruption," Lane muttered. "That's architecture." Malcolm stood very still, the weight of it pressing down. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone they erased." The room fell into silence, the kind that carried the weight of revelation. Rios looked at Malcolm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, what happens now?" Malcolm turned slowly to Leah, to Lane, to Rios. His voice cut through the air with quiet precision. "Now we burn it down. Legally." He lifted the sealed bag of narcotics, walked it to a secure locker, and signed it in as federal evidence. He turned to Lane. "Secure the samples. Start a trace protocol on every narcotic signed out under sealed clearance. Check for isotope matches." To Leah. "Tell your editor this story just tripled in size." And to Rios. "I need every log from the last 6 months. Audio, video, access codes, everything Elvos touched." For the first time since his arrest, Malcolm allowed himself a breath, a small release of pressure. The trap they had set for him had collapsed. But now he was walking into theirs, and this time he was ready. Rain fell soft against the desert that afternoon, a rare drizzle turning the dust into the faint scent of earth. Malcolm stood in the temporary operations room, eyes fixed on the wall where photographs, reports, and names sprawled across corkboard and digital screens alike. His arms stayed crossed over his chest, his face carved in that stillness that came not from calm, but from the weight of too much truth pressing in at once. To any outsider, he looked motionless, but his mind worked like machinery, piecing together fragments of betrayal, corruption, and ghosts that refused to stay buried. Marcus Lane entered quietly, carrying a slim, red-tabbed folder. His face told the story before his words did, the weariness in his eyes proof that what he had uncovered wasn't just bad, it was personal. "You need to see this," Lane said, his voice lower than usual. He set the folder on the table, pushing it across until it rested at Malcolm's hands. Malcolm opened it. The faded ink, the dated signatures, the name scrawled in black letters across the top, Logan Voss. For a moment, Malcolm simply stared at it, his breath pushing out slow through his nose. He had known this name would surface. He had prayed it wouldn't. Lane studied him. "You know him." Malcolm's jaw worked as though chewing a thought. "I used to." The memory came back unbidden, a flash of heat and blood. 9 years earlier, a warehouse in Juarez, the air thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder. Malcolm's weapon raised, his pulse hammering as cartel soldiers swarmed. And there, at his side, Logan Voss, smiling like a man who thought the world was a chessboard, and he was always 3 moves ahead. They had been partners then, part of an elite DEA team, running deep cover operations in places that chewed up lesser men. Malcolm had ignored the shadows in Voss, the shortcuts, the smirk that came too easily after close calls. But that raid in Juarez had pulled the mask away, evidence crates reopened, seals broken, samples missing, timelines rewritten to cover the gaps. Malcolm had confronted him, demanded answers. Voss had shrugged, dismissive. "They won't miss it," he'd said. "We get results, don't we? Isn't that what matters?" But Malcolm hadn't come from that school of thought. To him, the integrity of the badge was the line that could not bend. He had reported it. The agency had dishonorably removed Voss, wiped his record clean so the stink wouldn't stick. No noise, no trial, just gone. Or so Malcolm had thought. Back in the present, Lane tapped the screen on his laptop, pulling up a hidden blueprint buried deep in old DEA archives. The title read Ghost Ledger. "I thought this was a myth," Lane said. "Turns out it's real. The program was more than corruption. It was infrastructure, a system designed not just to falsify logs, but to recycle seized evidence from closed cases, repackage it as new, and spread it across unsuspecting targets. It flagged random suspects, planted matches in precinct systems, erased trails before anyone could connect the dots. And Voss was at the center, operating through rural stations with little oversight, using local officers as pawns in a game no one even knew was being played. Malcolm's hand pressed against the table, his knuckles whitening. Every case Leah Torres had listed, every ruined life, every erased name, it was all part of the ghost ledger. The evidence in his trunk hadn't been a random plant. It had been recycled, chosen, placed with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to exploit the system. As though summoned by his thoughts, Leah strode in, rain speckling her jacket, phone clutched in her hand. Her hair clung damp against her temples, her eyes burning with that relentless fire of a reporter who knew she was close to breaking something wide open. "You're not going to like this," she said, dropping a printout on the table. The paper showed an encrypted message pulled from a DEA internal account, time-stamped just minutes after Malcolm had been pulled over. The message was short, brutal. "He's exposed. Move now. Discard chain." Leah folded her arms. Somebody inside tipped him off. "Voss knew you were vulnerable before you even stepped out of your car." Malcolm stared at the words, then let out a long breath that sounded more like steel grinding against steel. He was always 5 steps ahead. "Not anymore." Leah leaned in. "What are you going to do?" Malcolm's eyes rose, dark and steady. "I'm going to rip the whole thing down. Every name on that thread, every officer who took his orders. And Voss?" He paused, voice hardening. "He was once my brother. Now he's the rot I have to cut out." The weight of those words hung heavy. Rios, who had been standing silent at the edge of the room, shifted uneasily. He wasn't sure what frightened him more, the scale of the system they were uncovering, or the calm certainty in Malcolm's voice as he promised to dismantle it. Hours later, the desert night pressed in around a rusted trailer half buried in sand. Inside, Ray Dullard paced like a caged animal, sweat streaking his temples, his nerves fraying with every creak of the wind. Nate Coyle sat slumped near a window, nervously peeling the label off a bottle of lukewarm water. They had been hiding for days. No phones, no contact, just waiting for help from the shadow that had always protected them. Someone had cleared their body cams. Someone had wiped the first layers of evidence. But help didn't mean safety, and the silence stretched longer each hour. When the first two vehicles pulled up outside, they didn't hear them. But the third, the one that braked with authority, cut through the air like judgment. A voice called out, sharp and commanding, "Step outside. Hands where I can see them." Ray peered through the blinds and froze. Daniel Rios stood outside, not the rookie from the station anymore, but a DEA agent in full tactical gear, badge gleaming on his chest, warrant in hand. Behind him, a line of federal agents took position, weapons trained, silent and ready. And beside them, Malcolm Grant himself. No sunglasses, no suit, just a steady gaze that seemed to cut through the trailer walls. Ray's mouth went dry, words dying on his tongue. Nate stumbled back, muttering, "Hell no, that rookie." His hands shook as he realized the shift. The men they had mocked, underestimated, were now the ones writing their ending. Malcolm didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply pulled a small object wrapped in a DEA seal from his pocket and tossed it to Rios. "Test it." Rios tore the seal, revealing a sample of the very powder they had claimed to find in Malcolm's trunk. He scanned it with a handheld device, the result chiming seconds later. Isotope match, pulled directly from Ghost Ledger storage. Ray's face turned pale. The walls of his world were collapsing. Rios raised his voice, clear and formal. "Raymond Dullard, Nathaniel Coyle, you are under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud federal authority. You have the right to remain silent?" Ray turned, voice tight with disbelief. "You're not supposed to be here." Malcolm stepped closer, his words slicing clean. "And you weren't supposed to abuse that badge. But here we are." This time they didn't resist. Nate dropped to his knees, hands on his head, the weight of truth finally breaking him. Ray stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes burning not with defiance, but with the bitter sting of being caught by the very man he had tried to humiliate. The cuffs clicked shut, justice echoing in the desert night. As agents secured the scene, Rios's secure line buzzed sharply. He answered, listened, then looked to Malcolm, his face pale. "Sir, there's movement. Voss just pinged off an encrypted channel. Someone tipped him off. He knows." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Ray and Nate were pawns, faces of rot, but the root was still alive. "Secure them," Malcolm ordered calmly. "And lock the station down." The desert wind picked up, whispering through the cracked trailer walls like the ghosts of all the erased names. Malcolm looked one last time at Ray. "You made the wrong enemy. This isn't about revenge. This is about every life you silenced. Justice has a voice now." Ray said nothing. His silence was no longer control. It was defeat. The days that followed blurred into a storm of motion. Warrants issued, hard drives seized. Leah's reporting streamed live to millions, her calm voice narrating the unraveling of a system that had buried the powerless. Families who had waited years for answers stepped forward, clutching photographs, whispering names that had almost been lost. Each testimony was a brick in the wall closing around Voss and the network he had built. In the war room, screens lit up with data. Lane traced isotopes from narcotics seized years earlier, now resurfacing in precinct evidence lockers hundreds of miles apart. Each match was another nail in the coffin. Rios pulled logs, hundreds of them, each rerouted through the same hidden node. Elvos appeared again and again, a phantom fingerprint marking the architecture of corruption. Malcolm watched it all, the weight in his chest heavier than triumph. For every connection made, for every case reopened, he thought of Elijah Brooks, the boy whose mother had pressed a flash drive into his hands with trembling fingers. He thought of Bernice's words, make them remember his name. He thought of every mother, every father, every child swallowed by a system that had forgotten them. And somewhere in the shadows, Logan Voss waited. The game they had once played together was no longer about tactics in a warehouse. It was about the soul of the system itself. Malcolm knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The drizzle had given way to clear skies by the time Malcolm left the precinct and drove toward the south side of town. The desert seemed washed clean by the rain, the air sharper, the colors deeper. But Malcolm barely noticed the horizon rolling past his windshield. His mind was fixed on the address written in his notebook, the one whispered to him by Leah Torres before she slipped away into the storm. It was a small house, she'd said, roses in the yard, and inside was a woman who carried both unbearable loss and undeniable truth. The neighborhood was quiet, worn down, but stubbornly alive. When Malcolm pulled up, he saw the roses first, blooming defiantly in the front yard of a faded house with sagging porch steps. The flowers glowed red against chipped paint, proof that care persisted even when the world tried to strip it away. He climbed the porch slowly, each board creaking under his weight, and knocked once. The door opened with a groan. A woman stood framed in the doorway, gray hair pulled back, eyes weary yet sharp. She leaned against the doorframe as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You must be Malcolm Grant," she said, voice low and tired. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, gentle as he could. "I spoke with your pastor." She gave a small nod, stepped aside, and let him in. The house was quiet. No television, no music, just the steady ticking of a wall clock. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind of scent that comes from someone trying to hold order together, even when grief tries to unravel everything. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single framed photo, a smiling young man, cap tilted, flashing a peace sign with one hand. Elijah Brooks, 19 years old. Bernice Brooks, Elijah's mother, stood near the fireplace, arms crossed tight. "They told me it was suicide," she said flatly. "Told me my boy took his own belt in a holding cell after they picked him up for suspicious behavior outside a store he'd been going to every week." Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "They wouldn't even let me see him at first. And when they finally did?" She shook her head, eyes hardening. He looked like someone had tried to rearrange his face. Malcolm swallowed, the burn of her words cutting through him. He had read the file the night before, had seen the sanitized language of official reports. But files didn't bleed. Mothers did. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words heavy with more than sympathy. He meant them in the marrow of his bones. Bernice didn't answer right away. She walked to a small drawer, pulled out a worn flash drive, and placed it on the table between them. "Miss Torres gave me this. Said you should see it." Malcolm slid the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, grainy security footage filling the room. Two officers dragging Elijah down a hallway, Ray Dullard and Nate Coyle, their faces unmistakable. No cuffs, just fists. They shoved him into a cell and slammed the door. The camera cut off, but the shadows flickering on the floor told the rest of the story. Flashing lights, sudden movement, violence carried out in a place meant for safety. Minutes later, the hallway camera showed Ray walking out alone. Malcolm closed the laptop slowly, his jaw clenched tight. Bernice's voice was a whisper. "They said there was no footage. Said it got erased in a system update." She lifted her eyes to his, and what he saw there was not just grief, but purpose, carved sharp by suffering. "My boy was gentle," she said. "Couldn't even watch boxing on TV, said it made his stomach hurt. And they expect me to believe he killed himself?" She shook her head again, fierce this time. "I know I'm not the only one. I know there are other mothers, other fathers, people who buried their children because somebody wanted to play God. And I know something else." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "If you're who they say you are, you didn't come here just to feel sorry for me." "No, ma'am," Malcolm said, voice steady. "Then make them remember his name." The words struck like a command, heavier than any federal order. In that moment, Elijah was no longer just a case file, no longer just a line in a corrupted system. He was a promise. The front door creaked, and Daniel Rios appeared, soaked from the rain, his expression unsure but determined. He had followed Malcolm quietly from the station, not because he had to, but because something inside him refused to let go. He stood in the threshold, dripping water onto the worn rug, and glanced at the photo on the mantel. "This the boy?" he asked softly. Malcolm nodded. Rios lowered his head. "I helped write that report. Didn't know what I was signing?" Bernice didn't flinch. She didn't spit venom. She simply looked at him and said, "Now you do." Silence filled the room, heavy but not hostile. Finally, Rios stepped forward. "Let me help fix it." Malcolm turned to Bernice. "Do you mind if he sees the footage?" She shook her head. Rios sat, eyes fixed on the grainy screen as the footage played. He didn't move, didn't blink, his jaw tightening as the shadows told their story. When the video ended, he exhaled shakily. "We've got everything we need to bury them." But Malcolm shook his head, voice low. "No, we're not burying them. We're exposing them." Bernice nodded once, tears glistening but not breaking her. "Then do it." Sometimes the sharpest enemy isn't the man in front of you, but the one who once stood at your side. Later that night, back in the makeshift ops room, Malcolm stared at the wall of files and names. His eyes scanned every face, every report, each one another reminder of the lives chewed up by the ghost ledger. Lane entered with more documents, his face grim. "You need to see this," he said again, dropping another folder on the table. Inside was more than evidence. It was memory. Logan Voss, his old partner, his old shadow. And suddenly, the personal and the professional bled together into something far more dangerous. But even with that storm building, it was Bernice's words that echoed loudest in his head. Make them remember his name. Elijah Brooks had become more than a victim. He was a symbol, and symbols had power when wielded with truth. Malcolm knew then that this fight was no longer about him surviving a false charge. It wasn't even just about dismantling Voss's syndicate. It was about giving voice to every silenced name, every erased record, every mother left with nothing but a folded photo and unanswered questions. As he sat in the dim light, the hum of computers and the shuffle of papers filling the silence, he realized he was carrying something heavier than a badge. He was carrying memory, and memory was the one thing corruption could not erase. The desert night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind sweeping across the barren land. A rusted trailer squatted in the sand, half buried, its walls groaning with each gust as if the desert itself wanted to collapse it. Inside, Ray Dullard paced like a man trapped in a cage too small for his rage. Sweat rolled down his temples, his shirt clinging damp to his back. Nate Coyle sat slouched near a cracked window, nervously peeling the label from a bottle of lukewarm water. His leg bounced, his nerves visible in every twitch. Days had passed since they had fled the station. No phones, no outside contact, no official word from the men who had always pulled strings for them in the shadows. The silence was beginning to crush them. Someone had cleared their body cams. Someone had wiped the first layer of their tracks. But even that kind of help felt thinner now, brittle under the weight of what they'd done. Protection had always felt guaranteed. Until now. Ray muttered under his breath, pacing harder. "They'll come for us. They have to. We did what we were told." Nate shook his head, his smirk long gone. "You sure about that? Feels like they're leaving us to rot." His voice cracked as he said it. "You saw Grant's face." "He wasn't scared, Ray. He was waiting." Ray spun, jaw tight, trying to summon the same swagger that had carried him through years of intimidation and lies. But the confidence didn't stick. His hands trembled when he thought about the man they had dragged across the hood of his car. They thought he had been just another target. But no. He had turned out to be something else entirely. Then, without warning, the night broke. Tires crunched outside, more than one vehicle. The sound of engines cut sharp through the stillness. Ray and Nate froze. The first two vehicles rolled in quietly, their approach muffled, tactical. But the third braked hard with authority, dust kicking up around it. A voice rang out, amplified, cutting through the desert like a knife. "Step outside! Hands where I can see them!" Ray darted to the blinds, his eyes widening. Floodlights pinned the trailer, the darkness swallowed by white beams. Dozens of figures moved in formation, federal agents, armored, silent. And at their front stood Daniel Rios, no longer the rookie shuffling nervously behind a desk, but a DEA agent armored and resolute, his badge glinting on his chest, a warrant clutched in his hand. "Hell no," Nate muttered, stumbling backward, his throat dry. That rookie? No way, but there he was, and he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, steady as a mountain, was Malcolm Grant. No suit, no sunglasses, no hint of the humiliation they'd tried to burn into him. Just calm authority, his gaze steady, cutting through the walls of the trailer as if Ray and Nate had already been dragged into the light. Ray's mouth fell open slightly, his voice caught between disbelief and dread. Malcolm didn't shout, didn't posture. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object wrapped in a DEA seal, and tossed it toward Rios. "Test it." Rios broke the seal, revealing a powder sample, the same isotope-laced narcotic Ray and Nate had once waved in Grant's face. The device beeped, its readout flashing clear, isotope match. Pulled straight from Ghost Ledger stock, identical to the evidence they had claimed to find in Malcolm's car. Ray's face drained of color. Nate stumbled back, hitting the wall as if the proof itself had struck him. Rios raised his voice, firm and unwavering, words rolling out with the authority of law. "Raymond Dullard, Nathaniel Coyle. You are under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud federal authority. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Ray's voice cracked, cutting in, desperate. "You're not supposed to be here. You're not supposed to—" Malcolm stepped forward, his words quiet but sharp enough to slice through Ray's protest. "And you weren't supposed to abuse that badge. But here we are." There was no fight left in them. Nate's legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees, hands pressed to the back of his head. His chest heaved, the weight of truth too heavy to carry anymore. Ray stood frozen, jaw clenched, body stiff, not in defiance, but in the bitter paralysis of a man who finally understood that the game was over. The cuffs clicked shut around their wrists, steel binding the hands that had once planted evidence and signed false reports. As the agents moved in, the desert filled with the sounds of command, boots against sand, the rustle of tactical gear, radios chirping. The once dominant officers were dragged out of the trailer like criminals, their power stripped in an instant. Nate wept quietly, tears streaking through the dust on his face. Ray said nothing, his silence no longer the mask of control, but the silence of a man crushed under the truth. Rios met Malcolm's gaze across the floodlit yard. His voice was quieter this time, almost awed. "I didn't know it would feel like this." Malcolm arched a brow, steady. "Feel like what?" Rios glanced at Ray and Nate, now cuffed and cornered, their eyes wide and hollow. He looked back at Malcolm. "Like justice has weight," Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes drifted toward the horizon where the desert swallowed the last trace of night, the first pale hint of dawn creeping upward. Justice was heavy, but it was also necessary. An agent approached, holding up a handheld scanner. "Sir, isotope confirms match. Same compound, same batch marker." Malcolm gave a single nod. "Then we have what we need." But before they could clear the scene, Rios's secure line buzzed sharply. He pressed it to his ear, listened, and his face went tense. "Sir," he said quickly, turning to Malcolm, "there's movement." "Voss just triggered an encrypted channel. He knows. Someone tipped him off." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his jaw set. Ray and Nate were pawns, their capture important but incomplete. The root still lived, still pulling strings. "Secure them," Malcolm ordered, voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "And lock the station down." The agents moved quickly, hustling Ray and Nate toward armored vehicles, their protests swallowed by the churn of engines. The desert wind picked up, whistling through the cracks of the trailer, carrying with it the ghosts of every erased name, every buried truth. Malcolm turned one last time to look at Ray, the man who had once ground ashes beneath his heel in smug superiority. "You made the wrong enemy," he said softly. "This isn't about revenge. This is about every life you silenced. And justice, it has a voice now." Ray didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence was no longer control. It was surrender. As the convoy rolled back toward the city, Malcolm sat in the lead vehicle, the hum of the engine vibrating through the floor. His reflection in the window stared back at him, eyes tired but unbroken. He thought of Elijah Brooks, of Bernice's words, make them remember his name. He thought of every face Leah had shown him, every file Marcus had uncovered, every erased person who deserved to be more than a statistic. Capturing Ray and Nate was victory, but it wasn't the end. It was only the opening move in a longer war, because somewhere in the shadows, Logan Voss was waiting, his hands still on the architecture of corruption that stretched far beyond two dirty officers. And Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over until the rod itself was burned out. The morning of the trial broke with a heavy sky. Clouds stretched thin above the federal courthouse like a veil that could not quite cover the storm brewing beneath it. The courthouse steps didn't feel like a place of law. They felt like a battlefield. Crowds had gathered early, spilling across the plaza, their voices rising in chants that carried blocks away. Cameras were everywhere, satellite vans parked along the curbs, wires crisscrossing like veins. Handmade signs lifted high into the air told the story before the gavel ever struck. Justice for Elijah. Fix the system. We see you now. At the front of it all stood Leah Torres, phone in hand, live stream broadcasting to millions. She didn't wear makeup, didn't wait for a production crew. She simply faced the lens and spoke in her calm, firm voice. This morning, the United States will be asked a question it has avoided for too long. Will we finally look justice in the eye? Her words cut through the noise, her audience swelling as comments and hearts flooded the stream. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a wire about to snap. Reporters filled the benches shoulder to shoulder. Families who had lost sons and daughters to false arrests and erased records clutched photos, their grief and hope mixing into something raw. In the third row, a single empty chair bore a taped photograph of Elijah Brooks, smiling in his cap, frozen forever at 19. It was a silent reminder of who had brought them all here. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The shuffle of shoes against the floor echoed like thunder, and then the room sat again, waiting. The atmosphere was taut, the air heavy enough to choke. At the defense table, Ray Dullard sat hunched, his once proud posture collapsed. Nate Coyle wouldn't even raise his head, eyes fixed on the table as though he could vanish into it. And beside them, in his own suit, Logan Voss sat upright, jaw tight, eyes flicking across the room with the calm calculation of a man who still believed he could maneuver his way out of a noose. When Malcolm walked in, there was no fanfare, no announcement. He wore no badge, no suit, no trappings of authority. Just a plain gray jacket, his shoulders steady, his face unreadable. But the room seemed to shift around him, the murmurs softening, the air thickening. He didn't need a title for people to understand what he represented. He had lived the story they were here to witness, and that was enough. The prosecution opened swiftly, their words sharp but restrained. They laid out the charges: evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud federal authority. For Voss, the list stretched longer: conspiracy at a federal scale, subversion of internal systems, distribution of seized narcotics, a blueprint of corruption etched into the ghost ledger. The jury's eyes followed every word, the weight of the case pressing heavy already. Then came the witnesses. The name called first was Mrs. Bernice Brooks. A murmur rippled through the gallery as she rose, her Sunday dress plain but ironed, her steps slow but steady. She carried no papers, no props. She didn't need them. When she took the stand, the courtroom quieted to a silence that felt holy. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore her oath, and then looked out at the jury. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I lost my son in that station," she began. Her words were flat, unembellished, but they carried like fire. "They told me he killed himself. Said he just gave up. But Elijah didn't give up. Elijah was a fighter. He was kind. He was 19. She paused, her throat working, breath steadying. He had asthma. Real bad since he was little. When they choked him, they knew he couldn't breathe. And they didn't stop. The air in the room changed. Even the judge leaned back, her expression unreadable, but her breath caught in her throat. Jurors shifted in their seats, some blinking hard, some tightening their jaws. Bernice's words stripped the courtroom bare. Behind the railing, Daniel Rios gripped the edge of his seat. His lips pressed into a line, his eyes red with the burden of what he had seen. Finally he stood, his voice low but clear. "Your Honor, permission to speak." The judge hesitated, then nodded. Rios stepped forward, turning not to the bench but to the jury. His hands shook slightly, but his voice steadied with each word. "I processed Elijah's arrest file. I signed off on the paperwork that said what those men wanted it to say. I didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't ask the right questions. But after I saw the footage, after I met his mother," he glanced at Bernice, then back at the jurors, "I knew. Elijah could have been my son." The room didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. It softened, like a wound being uncovered to daylight. For a moment, there were no uniforms, no titles, just people staring at one another with the weight of shared humanity. Malcolm sat quietly, hands folded, eyes steady. He had no need to speak. His presence alone told the story, that truth had outlasted lies, that dignity could not be erased by planted evidence or falsified reports. He had endured, and by enduring, he had turned the system's gaze upon itself. Hours stretched into days. Testimonies stacked like bricks. Forensic reports from Marcus Lane, tracing narcotics isotopes back to sealed DEA lockers. Leah Torres presenting case files and corrupted body cam logs, 47 names laid bare before the jury. Agents testifying about the Ghost Ledger's architecture, a conspiracy written in code and hidden in shadows. The defense tried to claw holes in the fabric, but the thread was too tight, too strong. Every denial frayed against the weight of evidence. Every excuse cracked under the voices of those who had lost. And all the while, Voss sat with that cold calculation as if waiting for some invisible hand to pull him free. But the longer the trial stretched, the smaller he looked, the more his certainty eroded. After 5 long hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood, voice firm. "We, the jury, find Raymond Dullard guilty on all counts. We find Nathaniel Coyle guilty on all counts. We find Logan Voss guilty of conspiracy, obstruction, and federal subversion." The courtroom stilled. The words hung in the air like a bell that could not be unrung. The judge wasted no time. Her voice rang sharp and clear, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Raymond Dullard and Nathaniel Coyle, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Ray flinched, his shoulders collapsing inward. Nate broke at last, tears spilling down his cheeks, his face buried in his hands. The courtroom watched as bailiffs stripped them of their service weapons, unpinned their badges, removed the belts that had once symbolized power. On national television, streamed to millions, the men who had once dragged Malcolm across a scorching hood stood exposed as criminals. Then the judge turned to Voss. "Logan Voss, you are hereby sentenced to 120 years under federal confinement at ADX Florence Supermax. Effective immediately." The words landed like a hammer. For the first time, Logan's face tightened. He rose to his feet, his voice defiant, sharp. "You people don't understand the machine you're poking." And for the first time that day, Malcolm rose as well. His movements were deliberate, slow, his presence filling the space. He looked Voss in the eye, his voice calm but carrying like a stone cast into still water. "No, you just didn't think the machine would ever turn on you." Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras clicked furiously. For the first time, Voss looked small. When the gavel struck, the courtroom didn't empty. People lingered, whispering, crying, hugging strangers they had never met. Outside, the crowd erupted, voices chanting, songs rising, tears falling. Justice didn't just echo that day. It thundered. Malcolm walked out quietly, no words for the cameras, no statements for the microphones shoved in his direction. His silence said everything. This wasn't about a headline. It wasn't about him. It was about the names that had been erased, the voices silenced, the families left waiting. And now at last the system had listened. The trial had ended, but the echoes of it refused to fade. For weeks, the footage replayed across every channel. Headlines flashing with words no one thought they would ever see. Corrupt officers sentenced to life. A rogue federal agent caged for over a century, families finally heard. Commentators debated the implications. Politicians scrambled to attach themselves to the tide of reform, and communities that had long carried quiet wounds lifted their heads a little higher. Justice had spoken in a courtroom, but in truth, the verdict belonged to the people who had been waiting to be seen. For Malcolm Grant, the noise was a storm he did not want. Washington called him within hours of the gavel striking, the president's chief of staff offering him the directorship of the DEA. The current director had resigned in disgrace, citing failures of oversight. A press conference was prepared, the stage set, cameras waiting. All that was missing was Malcolm himself. But when the appointed hour came, Malcolm wasn't in Washington. He wasn't even on a plane. He stood instead in a quiet hospital corridor in Phoenix, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. His hand wrapped around his nephew's. The boy's small fingers clutched his tightly, anchoring him in a way no title ever could. A staffer's voice rattled in his ear through the phone. "Sir, the press is waiting. The country is waiting. We need you here." Malcolm's reply was steady, almost soft. "I'd rather earn my nephew's trust than your title." And then he ended the call, the silence afterward more freeing than any applause. The world could have its ceremonies. He chose something else. A week later, on a Sunday afternoon, there was a knock at his door. When Malcolm opened it, Bernice Brooks stood there, wearing her best dress, her eyes steady though rimmed with the fatigue of grief that never fully lifted. In her hand, she held a small velvet box. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, placed the box on the kitchen table, and slid it toward him. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. Malcolm opened it slowly. Inside lay Elijah's junior police badge, bent slightly at one edge from when he had dropped it as a child, but still polished, still shining with the pride of a boy who had once believed in the system enough to dream of wearing its uniform. The sight of it hit harder than any verdict. "For everyone who had no one," Bernice said quietly. Malcolm stared at the badge for a long time, his reflection faintly glimmering back at him from the metal. He nodded, voice low but firm. "I'll carry it right." Across the country, Leah Torres released her final segment on the case. The screen faded in from black. No music, no graphics, just her voice. "Justice doesn't always scream," she said. "Sometimes it walks quietly through truth, resilience, and memory." The broadcast played the timeline. The stop on the desert road, the planted evidence, the corruption, the trial, the families, the verdict. And at the end, Elijah's photo filled the screen, smiling under a sunbeam, one hand raised to block the light. Leah's voice lowered to a whisper. "No more shadows." Not this time. The segment ended not with applause, but with silence, the kind that follows a truth too heavy for words. Malcolm didn't return to Washington. He didn't sit at a new desk or draft policies under fluorescent lights. Instead, he returned to the adobe house tucked just off the desert road, its porch creaking under his weight the same way it had for decades. The wind carried no orders now, no suspicion, no weight of missions waiting. Just the smell of sage and dust warmed by sun. That evening, as the horizon stretched long shadows across the floorboards, his nephew came running barefoot from the back door, a painted rock clutched in one hand, a scraped knee ignored in his excitement. He skidded to a stop in front of Malcolm, eyes wide, breathless. "Did you win?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He looked past the boy, toward the desert where light stretched thin and long, toward the horizon where justice still had miles to walk. Then he smiled, faint but real. "No," he said gently. "But I made it right." The boy didn't ask what that meant. He simply wrapped his arms around Malcolm's waist, squeezing tight, trusting without needing explanation. In that quiet embrace, Malcolm felt something he hadn't felt in years. The story exhaling, the fight pausing, the weight shifting into something bearable. In the weeks that followed, people would say Malcolm disappeared. No more press conferences, no speeches, no new appointments. But he hadn't disappeared. He had simply stepped where the spotlight could not reach. Bernice would visit from time to time, bringing coffee and quiet conversation, the two of them sitting on the porch as the desert wind rustled the roses she had planted near his steps. Lane would send updates from the lab, tracing the last of Ghost Ledger's threads until there was nothing left to unravel. Rios would check in with small reports, his voice steadier each time, as though he had finally grown into the man he was meant to be. And Leah's broadcasts would continue, her stories sharper, her audience larger, her voice unshakable. But Malcolm? He stayed with family. He chose dinners over debriefings, laughter over lectures, memory over mission. The badge Bernice had given him sat on the mantel, not as a relic, but as a promise. A reminder that justice wasn't measured in titles, but in the lives it restored, the names it remembered. One evening, as the desert sky burned orange and purple, Malcolm stepped outside and watched his nephew chase fireflies across the yard. The boy's laughter rang out like a song against the stillness. Malcolm smiled, feeling the weight of Elijah's badge in his pocket. Justice was never finished. It was a road without end. But for the first time in years, he let himself believe that walking it didn't always mean walking alone. The story of Malcolm Grant didn't end in the courtroom, or in Washington, or even in the headlines. It ended here, in the quiet of a house by the desert, in the arms of family, in the whispers of mothers who knew their sons' names would not be erased, in the voices of people who had finally been heard. As the sun dipped and the first stars blinked awake, Malcolm sat back in his chair, listening to the wind. He thought of Elijah. He thought of Bernice's strength, Rios's courage, Leah's relentless voice, Lane's loyalty. He thought of every erased name now written again in the ledger of memory, and he thought of tomorrow, knowing that justice's work was never done. But for tonight, it was enough. He closed his eyes, the desert's breath cool against his skin, and let the silence settle. And when the screen finally faded to black, one final line lingered, simple and unyielding. This is fiction. But ask any black man and he'll tell you, it isn't far from real.